Hi, my name is Brandon Morgove. I'm going to give a brief talk, speech if you will, on American foreign policy. I have a passion for the subject and haven't been fully satisfied or pleased with the way America has been acting as a nation on the world stage the last couple of years. So my speech is called Of Our Own Making, How American Foreign Policy in Ukraine and the Middle East has helped set the stage for conflict and what can be done about it, or might be done about it. All right. Hi, my name is Brandon. I'm a proud Portlander, Portland, Oregon. I grew up here and am enamored of the town. I'm also a patriotic American who loves this country, from Mark Twain to Magic Johnson. The first is, of course, an iconic writer whose ideas I liked, and the latter is my favorite basketball player in a sport I believe was invented here. Yes, I am glad to be an American, for it is a place where I can be me and have the freedom to do my thing. In other countries, I could have been dead by now, places like Russia, perhaps. But forgive me if I'm starting to feel as if this same liberty we exult in is becoming a hard-to-see-through veil for a cutthroat and careless selfishness at home, and a very cleverly spun and difficult to honestly appraise foreign policy abroad, with our leaders consistently referring to ourselves as something like the indispensable nation, but with seemingly less and less of what I would think are the attending virtues that should make most countries hold us in worthy esteem. I can just hear a good many Americans saying, "Me too, I agree." The thing is, I don't think most Americans are honing in on the same fault in our stars as I am. Today, though, I want to focus on what could quickly become a disaster for us all, and yet is something I think few Americans are seeing properly. And this is how America has been acting on the world stage, and just as bad to me, how Americans themselves see and understand this. For a reference point, I want to focus on two relationships that I've studied much the last couple of years. The one between the U.S. and Iran, and the one between the U.S. and Russia. From the two of these, I believe many seeds of conflict were sown, and that these were seemingly avoidable and, in my eyes, unjustifiable occurrences. Let's start with the Iran nuclear deal. It's also called the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This was a deal brought forth during the Obama administration after something like the longest diplomatic negotiations in history between several countries. It was a deal reached not just with the United States, but also with China, France, Russia, the UK, and Germany. The top countries in the history of world relations thus far, right? The deal in a nutshell was a way to limit Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. When Donald Trump became president, he shredded the deal unilaterally, meaning none of the other countries that signed on to the deal followed suit. They stayed aboard the deal. This action was reminiscent to me of how, if I remember right, the U.S. invaded Iraq years back. Only Britain supported us then. All the other countries, including the European countries like I think France and such, were trying to stop us. I was too back then, in my own way, from a distance. According to what I consistently read, there was no evidence that Iran had broken the deal. Trump stated it was a bad deal for the United States and thought he could use a maximum pressure campaign to bring Iran to sign a new deal more to his liking. In fact, we soon almost went to war when Trump had Iran's top military commander, a national hero of sorts, Qasem Soleimani, assassinated. It was in what was seemingly a breach of international law. Now, how did this sow the seeds of future conflict, you might ask? In more ways than you and I might know or think is my answer. Yes, it is within the rights of an American president and other world leaders to break treaties and not honor agreements. It happens a lot in world history. But this was a deal worked out with many countries, unusual to me in those respects. By the U.S. unilaterally breaking this deal, I believe we sent some sort of message to the whole world especially countries of significant power with a somewhat adversarial relationships to us, like China and Russia, that we are not to be trusted. We will do what we want, when we want, and then change our minds when we see a little better opportunity. If you read some articles about how the Ukraine invasion came to be by, for instance, Jack F. Matlock Jr., who was the ambassador to Russia under Reagan and George H.W. Bush, conservative presidents, or the article Why Are We in Ukraine by Benjamin Schwartz and Christopher Lane in Harper's Magazine of this year, very good article, you will see accounts of how Vladimir Putin made goodwill gestures towards the U.S. He was the first foreign leader to call President Bush after 9/11 to offer support and facilitated the attack on the Taliban regime. But always disapproved of, like every other Russian leader, NATO expansion, calling it unrelated to ensuring security in Europe and a serious provocation. It is worthwhile to take note of what I just wrote, because in the West, we have been consistently calling Russia's statement that NATO expansion is a great deal for their invasion a red herring, meaning false clue or false, false, I don't know how to explain it, but you know what I mean. And yet for decades, you're going to find written and spoken examples of Russian leaders clearly stating they had big problems with the expansion of the military alliance. Now, what is the difference between the U.S. not being willing to tolerate Russia having missiles in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis and Russia fuming over what has been a decades in the making expansion of NATO right up to their border? How is it the American public and our leadership, as well as Europe's leaders and our corresponding media outlets, have for the most part withheld this part of the reality of the situation? My point here is, when Putin finally decided to really invade Ukraine after all his years in office, perhaps he deemed the United States to have reached some low point of trustworthiness. Don't think that is necessarily an ironclad fact, but it holds some water. Us breaking the Iran nuclear deal certainly didn't help bring the U.S. and Russia closer together. But on to the nuclear deal again. Another potential consequence of us breaking it is that it may have helped foster the incentive for the Hamas attack. To be honest, the Middle East is newer to me, and I do not understand enough of what is going on there in the region, although I have been studying it. But the greatest virtue to me of the Iran nuclear deal was that it offered a framework to reset what I see as some of the United States missteps in the Middle East. I was not pro-invasion of Iraq years back, as I said. To me, it seemed more like a revenge military action for 9/11 than what it purportedly became, a regime change undertaking done in the name of eradicating weapons of mass destruction that did not exist. Being that Hamas has ties to and is somewhat sponsored by Iran, the United States and Iran somewhat cooperating would seemingly diminish Hamas's reason d'etre for attacking Israel. And also, if they did, would make the chances of Iran backing them should they attack Israel less, I believe. It may have been difficult to have counted on the Iran nuclear deal to hold forever. I don't think most thought it would. But it would likely have helped also perhaps restore peace in Yemen and taken the U.S. out of its morally awkward relationship to that battleground as well in our backing of the Saudis. Why Biden didn't resign the Iran nuclear deal when he became president is to me very similar to how the U.S. and its leadership in general since the end of the Cold War have acted towards Russia in the lead up to Putin's invasion. We want to have our cake and eat it too. Risk almost nothing and get everything we possibly can out of every other country. President Biden stated he wanted to resign the Iran nuclear deal when he came into office. Why he didn't seems to me, once again, an act of American hubris or lack of political backbone, or both. Biden was there when the Iran deal was struck under Obama. Now judge for yourselves. If the U.S. pulled out of the deal that Iran was deemed to be in compliance with, and then went on to impose crippling sanctions on the same regime, inflicting great financial and humanitarian cost upon it, should not, if the deal were to be re-signed, be bent much more in Iran's favor than when it was initially drawn up. Had Biden simply taken Iran's Revolutionary Guard off the blacklist, a move most people really thought meant nothing other than of being of symbolic importance, I would think we could have gotten that deal back. But he wasn't able to do that. To me, that was a mistake. I'm not saying the Iran deal can't be still re-signed, but to me, I don't know. I don't know how they could do it. Possibly. It takes a foreign policy thinkers. But I'm not even sure if it's good for anybody at this point. But the parallel to Russia is important to draw, because since Gorbachev and Reagan ended the Cold War, the United States and NATO have been grabbing as many of the old former Soviet republics as they could get. Gorbachev, in an interview shortly before his death on the eve of Putin's invasion, said America grew arrogant and reckless after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Jack Matlock, ambassador to Russia, who had brought it before, stated that Gorbachev was assured by President George H.W. Bush that NATO would not expand 1 inch east. So where does that leave us now? And what is to be drawn from these two examples? Well, let me quote a professor I emailed about my stance on Ukraine. He wrote me, "The foreign policy establishment in D.C. has a monopoly on truth. It is very hard to have a serious discussion on Ukraine." He went on to say, "On this issue, we're way beyond Irving Janis's thesis about groupthink. We have unithink. For instance, when it comes to Ukraine, I don't see much difference between the conservatives and the liberals or Democrats in America. On one side, the conservatives seem mostly to want us to defeat Russia, but they don't consider this necessarily our war and don't want to spend our money on it. While the Democrats and liberals are either against war in general, or they really want us to back Ukraine to the hilt to achieve what everyone seemingly wants to believe is World War II all over again. The problem here is, I believe most of his thinking is currently a fallacy. After much reading and what I would call objective thinking, I feel as if I am watching a boxing match with like 3 people: Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. In this match, and through the eyes of our media, I feel Russia is often getting punched below the belt outside of the view of the cameraman in our media, Western media, and has no control over the truth of the fight outside of it, sphere of influence, or sympathizers. You could probably say the same thing about our perception of Ukraine and Russia over here, or over in Russia, but I believe the core truths about the lead up to the invasion really ought to have come more to the light of day out here in the West. I am not a Putin apologist here. He has seemingly done some things that I find reprehensible, but the truth of why I believe he invaded Ukraine is as follows. He is someone who came of age when Russia was a great empire and worked his way through the rank of the empire and feels obligated by duty to retain a fraction of it, especially one of such strategic significance as Ukraine. In the words of former National Security Advisor to Cardo, Zygmunt Brzezinski, without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire. As most of the former Soviet republics are now members of NATO, I believe Putin just said to himself, enough is enough. You guys aren't going to grab this one last thing. And for him, as proud leader of his country, the same person that as a younger man defended a Russian embassy against a mob when the Berlin Wall fell in Germany, you could just say he is mostly doing his patriotic duty in this respect. Likewise, the eastern part of Ukraine is mostly Russian, and the Ukrainian government had made clear prior to the invasion that it had no intention of implementing the agreement reached in 2015 for reuniting the Donbass provinces into Ukraine with a large degree of local autonomy, an agreement with Russia, France, and Germany that the United States endorsed. We in America and the West have been clamoring that Putin is threatening to take over all of Europe. There is, in my eyes, no clear reason to suppose that. I think he mostly just wants the eastern part of Ukraine and to secure his land bridge to the Black Sea, that being the most important, with Russia's Black Sea fleet being stationed there. There's another article I could read on that which explains the importance of that, but look into the strategic importance of the Black Sea for Russia, and you can see why they're dogging up on that. We in America and the West have been clamoring, yes, there is my eyes, no clear reason to suppose that he wants to take care over all of Europe. Yet we in the U.S. are acting as if this is a new great cause. To me, this is us coordinating a country which is a great deal Russian, which is not ultimately likely to have that bad of a life under Putin, and risking a nuclear conflict over something which ought to be looked at basically as another people's civil war. If Putin wanted to go further than Ukraine, well then we're in. But ain't that just what we're looking for? A reason to jump in this. That's how it feels to me. Ukraine coming over to join the West is more of a notch on our bedpost than a fight for democracy. And here we are driving all of our enemies together because one of our former half-enemies decided to dog up a bit and get back some of what he felt was his. Russia is different than us. They act differently. Kind of brutish. You can see this in the Wagner Group. Iran is different than us. They are both their own kind of totalitarian societies. But in both cases, we took what could have been a somewhat workable relationship and over time have created a potential existential threat to civilization on two expanding fronts. This was unnecessary. It is unnecessary. If we have values, if we have virtues, then we can exemplify those along with the beautiful world and way of life our freedom can create for us. Places that do not have freedom will be moved in that respect to get it for themselves. We ought not to break all sorts of international laws to make the world a little more as we want it, especially when we are not perfect as we seem here at home. That is what I think some of those countries over there understand. And this does count. Just because we are free does not necessarily make us more righteous. Take as an analogy a boxer that currently has the belt. Doesn't mean he just gets to keep it. He has to continually prove himself. As the journalist and foreign policy critic Walter Lippmann wrote, a mature great power will make measured and limited use of its power. We are still a great power in my eyes, barely. Barely in terms of virtue and wise decision making, especially. And I love to live here. But if we are to remain so, we're going to have to consistently act without vengeance, without pride, and to really cut close to a just path to our collective virtues and truths as we can. Do our due diligence. Right now, we are willfully flying way too blind, seeking a great victory in Ukraine, getting overly emotional about the Hamas attack and not having the courage to disappoint a few worked up Americans is a great danger to us. America's gain at this moment is going to have to come from a deeper, stronger place than that, one of humility and wisdom. That can get us on a better path. Now, just for a few closing off-cuff remarks, it's hard to imagine what to do in Ukraine at the moment. I believe some sort of agreement has to be worked out based on what I said. And after that, I don't know how to stop the tide of almost like this tree we have planted. Not a good tree. We might have to have some sort of arms deals or something where we have inspections. I would hate to see a huge arms race between us and Russia and China. Maybe some new treaties or something that have some ways to monitor stuff. In the Middle East, I don't know either. I don't know. I can't see a way. I guess act with great wisdom and discretion on both fronts. It's going to be a task for foreign policy thinkers. And then just ongoing, I think if America is going to wants to be a great power, it's going to have to be greater in all the capacities of what I would call more a good nation than a great nation. Not just fighting for freedom, but doing it in all aspects of our character. Not just with physical strength. That's a virtue in that, but there's other ways to be virtuous on a day-to-day level as a country. So my name is Brandon, and that's my talk for the day. Thank you.